Our first speaker this morning is the Hon Brad Hazzard MP, who is the Minister for Family and Community Services and Minister for Social Housing in New South Wales. He is leading a very significant set of policy reforms, which I'm sure we're very eager to hear more about. Will you please welcome Minister Hazzard?
Well, thank you very much, Ian, and welcome to all of you for this bright Melbourne morning. Could I start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which we're meeting today, and particularly acknowledging the elders who might be here today. I think it's very significant that Aboriginal people, of course, manage these lands for 60,000 years, and due to that fantastic management, we can now meet here today and pursue the agenda of making sure that all of us as a community grow stronger and better. Can I also acknowledge Professor Harper, who's, I understand, speaking straight after me, and I'm looking forward to hearing what he has to say. And can I also acknowledge all of you? This is a very difficult and challenging area, ensuring that we have more and appropriate housing right across this country, and each of you work in areas that impact very much on how, one, we deliver, but two, how we, on the ground, see those services given to the members of the community who need it. Can I start off by just saying that I intend to keep to the time schedule, so that's unusual for a politician, but I'll try. And I also want to just give you a few minutes at the end there for any questions that you might like to raise. So I just want to give a little bit of background for those of you who are not from New South Wales, and I think there are very few here today from New South Wales. In New South Wales, the coalition government came into power now 5 years ago. And in the last couple of years particularly, there's been an intense focus on moving into the area of support for social and affordable housing. But the great challenge in New South Wales was initially, when we came into government in 2011, simply getting housing. There was the lowest housing starts occurring in New South Wales in more than 3 decades. And that was the greatest challenge for us. In fact, I was the planning minister at the time, and so I come to this portfolio having that background of knowing just how we went about reversing that situation. Now, very important for New South Wales because you can only deliver the sort of community services and the opportunities you need to support the vulnerable if you have an economy that is strong. And New South Wales did not have a strong economy when we came in 2011. In fact, we were the lowest of all states and territories on almost every economic indicator, saving except for a couple of indicators in Tasmania. If there are any friends here from Tasmania, I love Tasmania, but they were the only ones who were just below us on a few of those. So we had to turn housing around. And we set a very simple agenda. The government, the Premier, and I as Planning Minister certainly prioritised getting housing moving from the point of view of getting particularly the economy moving. Now we did that, and there are some lessons in that we understand that I don't think I need to bother you with today, except to this extent. You need a clear vision, a very clear vision in government that requires all other agencies to come together with that clear vision. It's a great challenge in government because more often than not, everybody's operating in their silos and they're not particularly focused on one particular vision. We did achieve that. Now New South Wales, as a result, have more houses being produced than any other state or territory. And indeed, more houses in New South Wales have been produced than we've produced in 5 decades. So we got that part right. And as we started to move into that area, we also progressively started to look at, well, how do we actually then take with us those who are still needing support and coming down that path with us, but somewhere back further. Those who are in the vulnerable and the needy section of the community who simply need that extra help that perhaps governments often haven't given as well as they should. Hence, this new program. Now, if I can start by just saying, in the social housing area in New South Wales, we have 60,000 social or public housing. 130,000, I should say, 130,000, 60,000 on the waiting list. Probably, in my estimation, there's more like 200,000 who are not on the waiting list but who would like to get into social or affordable housing. So we still have an almighty challenge in the sense that We have those houses that we have tenancies in there, but we also have a lot more people needing to get into social housing. We also have a changing demographic, which is typical of right across Australia, I think, and that is that if we go back 20, 30 years, most of our social housing, most of those now 130,000 homes, were occupied by low-income workers. Today, they are not. Today, around about 94.5% are occupied by people who are not working. They're on some form of Commonwealth benefit, of some sort of social welfare. Now, the challenge for us, the challenges I set as Minister, were to renew the housing stock because it's old and it's not very nice in certain areas. In fact, in some areas, like the centre of Sydney, the Waterloo Towers, Waterloo and Redfern, are just terrible. In other areas, the housing stock is still, even further afield, less than acceptable. So renewal is one aspect. Two, we set, which is unusual for a Liberal national government, we set the agenda of actually increasing dramatically the amount of social and public housing. That was something which didn't happen under the former Labor government. I'm not addressing politics there, but simply saying that the former government had found it challenging, as all governments do, and they have been effectively eating their own housing stock to provide the ongoing recurrent expenditure for maintenance and for doing the essential work just to keep that housing stock in place. So we actually set an agenda which was we want to renew stock, but we want to increase stock, and we want to increase it dramatically. And that is a very challenging circumstance, even when a state's doing fiscally well. So we have looked at that. We've also looked at a second issue, which is how do we support those people who are, in fact, capable of moving out of the social housing stock? It's only a small percentage, as I said before, probably about 5.5%. Maybe there's another few percent in that largely social welfare supported group, the 94.5%. Maybe there are some there. But also, how do we make sure that we aren't simply renewing and supporting another potential lot of social housing tenants? Because the evidence is clear that people who grow up in social housing are very likely to end up in social housing. That's just the nature of the research in this area. So we want to intervene at all levels. And of course, the third section that we're particularly interested in was for those people who are in social housing, we want to provide a better outcome, because many of them report that they're not happy with what they're receiving or what they have received. And certainly, from my point of view as a Minister, I don't think that we haven't been supporting those people in an adequate way. So with that background, a few months ago, we launched our future directions for social housing policy. It's a policy that is set out over the next 10 years, and it's very ambitious, extremely ambitious, because it addresses each one of those three areas that I just talked about. I want to start with the issue, though, of new housing, more housing, and that is a challenge. As I said, no government has boundless amounts of money. It's our money, it's our taxpayers' money. So we have to find innovative ways to do that. Now, the principal way that the Future Directions policy identifies is an area that, or of approach that we've entitled Communities Plus. And it's pretty simple. It comes off the back of the fact that we have billions of dollars worth of assets, that is land and old stock. And so to address the issue of renewal of the stock, we sat down and said, well, why can't we partner? Why can't we get in with the private sector and say to them, what can you do for us on this particular parcel of land or these other group of parcels of land? What can you do for us to build new social housing, new affordable housing? Because if you're going to transition people from social housing to private housing, you do need more affordable housing. And in return, you can build a percentage of private housing on that land. Now that has the opportunity for us of creating a very competitive environment amongst the private sector. Yeah, the private sector is already showing interest, a great degree of interest. And we have some history here in New South Wales. Not all good ideas are necessarily of one particular political persuasion. In fact, when I started talking about this idea, an old friend of mine, Maurice Yemmer, former Labor Premier in New South Wales, and I sat down at a cup of coffee, And he said to me, well, have a look to see what you've done, what we did, but you finished in Riverwood. Well, and he said to me, we had a struggle getting it going, but I think you can do a lot more of it. I went and had a look at what we did in Riverwood. Riverwood is an area in Sydney that we're very well located, extremely well located. It's near a railway, or it's got a railway line nearby, it's got a main motorway nearby. It's an old World War II World War II defence housing, actually US built housing estate. And the particular accommodation is not really great, to say the least. In fact, some parts are just terrible. And what happened under the former government, and then delivered by us, was that there was an area set aside where it was put out to the private sector. The specific question that was asked, though, was, will you build us X number of social housing? For that, you can have this parcel and put your private housing there. Now, I think we can do far better than that in a competitive sense, because the issue going to the private sector should be about how much can you deliver for us and what quality can you deliver for us, rather than actually specifying this is what we want. Because you really do need to bounce off the back of that competitive edge. Having said that, the outcome was very good, but there are some lessons to be learnt. And one of those lessons was that we still went back to a traditional view from the agency, from the department, apparently, in arguing with the private sector who won it, that, well, you know what, you can't have security parking in public housing or social housing. They don't have that. You can't have coverings on the window. Now that presented a problem, because the private sector, who had won the opportunity to build, wanted to be able to build units that were absolutely identical in all manner, shape and form from the outside, and certainly as well as possible from the inside, as what they were going to sell. Net result, the actual builder in that case, the developer, took on some additional responsibility, insisted on security parking, insisted on coverings for the windows. Fantastic result. They had a very positive outcome. Their units sold off the plan, even though it's sitting right in the middle of a public housing estate. That message was loud and clear to our government, that we could do a lot more in this space. There's also a history of getting better social outcomes if you get the mix right. Now, in Minto and some of the areas in Western Sydney, we've had some renewal of public housing estates, not increasing. It was done under the former government, not increasing the total social housing, but seeing a mix move to 70% private, 30% public. Massive drop in antisocial and criminal activity. And the beauty for me as Minister is I want to have a social housing mix in New South Wales that says when a little kid grows up, they see the next door neighbour possibly going off to work, you know, doing whatever they're doing, heading off in their overalls to work somewhere or carrying their briefcase, and sending that message, a very clear message, that no, you don't have to live your life in social housing. That isn't it. If it's good for your family because they had challenges, fine, but if you haven't got those challenges, move on. So we're getting in New South Wales under future directions in terms of our policy, substantially more housing. That's the aim. And we're also getting a better mix of housing, aiming for around about 70% public, private and 30% public, for the reasons I've just set out. Now, in the mix of all that, as I said to you, we've called that the Communities Plus program. We also have an additional fund, which is like magic for a minister. We managed to convince Treasury that a $1.1 billion fund would provide the stimulus for a lot of renewal and extra housing. In the first little session of this fund, we're expecting about 3,000 new homes to come as a result of it. And what that fund will do, it's called the SAF fund, or SAF, it's aiming to use the investment income to support, for example, groups that might come together. It could include the private sector, but we envisage more likely it's going to be groups like the major charities who have land all across, for example, Sydney, Newcastle and Wollongong, who just haven't quite been able to get there in terms of renewal of their land and their stock. But those monies will be available to put in a support fund to make sure that they can actually deliver on what we would like to see them deliver, which is a lot more social and affordable housing. So, for example, and I'll pick on a couple, the Salvation Army, Mission Australia, they have large tracts of land across New South Wales, Australia indeed, but certainly Sydney. And if we can look at them partnering possibly with the private sector and giving them some support through that fund, then we'll do it. Now, we're working through the details of that, but the incredible opportunity to be able to convince Treasury and a government to set up a $1.1 billion fund. And I've got to acknowledge in that exercise NCOS. NCOS worked with us prior to the election. I mean, it's a wonderful partnership between the social welfare sector and the private sector and government to actually produce that fund. Now, in addition to all this, in addition to getting more housing, better mixes of housing through both the Communities Plus that is going out to the private sector and saying, what can you do for us on these particular parcels? We're also looking at, as I said, improving the outcomes for people in social housing. And that is very much about making sure that they have an opportunity to get increased access to education, health, mental health and so on. And in fact, we're putting in about 280 million over 5 years to support those sorts of services. And we'll be trying to build off that as much as we can. We anticipate that will provide, again, the support, particularly for young people, but for those who want to move out of public housing or social housing, and they just need that bit of extra support through education or health or mental health issues being addressed. Now, the competitive edge, of course, also comes through the fact that as we do the new private housing, just building housing has never been the answer. I was very frustrated many years ago as a backbencher and then as a shadow minister that the Department of Housing, as we had in New South Wales at the time, was simply of the view that they should put a roof over somebody's head. That's not the way, in our view, and in a way of our government's view, it should happen, and I think the public sector now are totally on side with this. It should be about delivering services that can help people achieve better outcomes for themselves, one way or another. So what we've looked at and what we're going to deliver is, and what we expect when we build these new houses, people won't be able to come to us and say, or private companies won't be able to come to us and say, oh, we can build you X. No. They come to us and say, we're partnering with a particular, for example, non-government organisation, which I'd expect, perhaps a community housing provider, to manage those properties, but to manage the services. And again, that competitive edge. I mean, for some of you who may not remember, back in, I think it was 2008, COAG agreed, so the Council of Australian Governments got together and all states and territories agreed that they have about 35% of their public housing stock moved over to community housing providers. Now, I think most states and territories are on track with that, and we're certainly committed to that. But one of the changes that I have been insisted upon as Minister is that, again, going back to that competitive edge and benefit that we can get out of providing opportunities to the community housing sector, is to recognise their value, but to also lay down in the recontracting process, and we're in that process at the moment, particular outcomes for the community housing sector. Particular outcomes that go to addressing, supporting and giving advantage or giving opportunity to the tenants they have. Now, the community housing sector has been probably in play in a major way for maybe 25, 30 years. And of course, each state and territory has some substantial community housing providers, and they're very good. And if you're here from a community housing provider, I acknowledge the work you do and thank you. But also say this to your sector, that we expect in New South Wales that there will be competitive edge in the sense of outcomes, real outcomes for the people who you're looking after. Some of the people who live in community housing now get very good support, some not so good. The purpose of our intent, or the intent we have, is to make sure that as we recontract, we lay out very clearly what the objectives, what the outcomes will be of you actually having the entitlement to have the transfer of properties across to you. Future Directions also lays out that in that process it will be a longer lease. We haven't specified the period yet that the community housing providers would take. I think it's fair to say that I did look at transfer of title. There has been some transfers of title over the last few years under the former government, and it was certainly something which I was open to until there were some very strong fiscal arguments put to us as to the impact on the state's budget of alienating property value. So the challenge for us has been to say, well, how long should a lease be to allow community housing sectors to be able to achieve the outcomes we want to achieve, but also particularly to leverage and build new properties, hopefully. And that's what we're talking to the community housing sector in New South Wales about right now. So I'm going to stick to my time, because I don't want to hold up Professor Harper, because I could talk about this for another couple of days if I wanted, if you were prepared to stay. But I will say this: I thank AHURI particularly. Ian, thank you to you for the opportunity to say a few words. I have to say, if you come to these conferences, I value particularly as a minister, and I know other ministers around the country do. I know the Federal Minister Christian Porter was here not that long ago speaking to, I think it was the national conference. We value the research and work that is done by AHURI, because it feeds into so much of our thinking and helps us with that thinking. To achieve new outcomes, you need a really good capacity of thought processes, research to practice, and AHURI does that magnificently. So, Ian, thank you to you. Thank you to all of you for being here today and for taking part. Happy to take a few questions if that's what you want, or I'm more than happy to listen to Professor Harper, because I really do want to listen to him, and I can only stay till lunchtime, so definitely don't be late for him. But any quick questions, if there are any, happy to take them. Otherwise, we'll move on to Professor Harper, up the back on the right. Oh, sorry, Ian's in charge. I'm not. Keep forgetting I'm not in Parliament, sorry.
So thank you very much indeed. Please thank the Minister for his... We do have some time for questions. I'm not sure if this is on. We do have some time for questions. You can send them through on the app and I'll pick them up here, or we've got microphones running. So Joseph, first question. Thank you.
Joseph Conlon from Victoria. In Victoria, we're unencumbered by a strategic plan about affordable housing and social housing. I'm just wondering what the killer political arguments are to Treasury to get housing on the agenda.
Well, in terms of Treasury, and there has to be, you're quite right, one of my experiences as being the former Planning Minister and then the Attorney General and Justice Minister at various stages was to always have an argument that convinces Treasury on the net benefit cost. If you can't do that, you're pushing it up the proverbial. In this case, so many of the people who come through social housing, it's a compounding effect in terms of the cost of those people to the community if they don't end up moving out of the private sector, or the costs, for example, of the justice system. And I was able to get our agency to work very effectively on that, particularly when you look at the number of children, for example, who are in out-of-home care or foster care, and the movement of those young people into the justice system. So I think at the end of the day, you do need to be able to argue to Treasury what the net benefit cost is, and look at the broad picture of your population, where they're going to end up, and what the likely cost would be if you can't support those people in moving into the private sector, moving into education, moving into a job. One example, Aboriginal people, for example, an Aboriginal person on our estimates who is not supported through the appropriate years can cost just $1.25 million. I think that's an underestimate, because I don't think they can really get to the figures. $1.25 million over the first 10 years of their life just in support services. So it's a lot better to be putting the money up front, supporting them and getting them out to be independent and giving them a sense of that independence, than leaving them dependent on social welfare forever.
Thank you. Question.
Minister Gary Moore from Parramatta City Council in New South Wales.
And formerly NCOS Gary. I'm saying nice things about NCOS Gary.
Absolutely. Yeah. Is this on okay? Yeah. Firstly, congratulations on the initiatives that you outlined. My question is, I guess, at the affordable end, and thinking about the mass growth in Western Sydney and places such as Parramatta or Liverpool or elsewhere, and what your views are about how we can make improvements to get key worker housing, particularly in what is a spectacular growth of housing stock, particularly apartments.
Very challenging. What we're talking about, I think Gary's talking about there, is that area of housing that I addressed a little earlier by just quickly referring to it as affordable housing. So the bridge, if you like, between possibly moving out of social housing and into private housing. Look, I think first of all I have to say that there's a strong view in the community sector that there should be inclusive zoning across all land. I don't share that view, and I come to that from the former planning minister's perspective, and say that if we had done that to the private sector, who had done their business cases and got their land, then that would have meant that probably we wouldn't have achieved what we've achieved in New South Wales and now leading the Australian economy. But I do think there's an argument to say that certainly in government land that has been given over effectively to the private sector to partner and to be in a competitive environment, part and parcel of that must be affordable housing. Now, we haven't reached the stage where it is a must be in New South Wales. That's a Brad Hazzard Social Housing Minister view, and I'm still working with my colleague Minister Stokes on that. And there have been one or two examples where it's been said to us, well, you haven't done that, but there have been a number of examples where it has been. So, for example, in the social housing area at Ivanhoe Estate, which, for those of you who don't know, inner city ride, well, not inner city, but not 20 minutes out of right of the heart of Sydney. That was 220-something social housing, and we're now getting, I think it's 556 social housing and around about 200-something affordable housing and about 1,800 private housing. So I think that is very much on the agenda, and certainly I'll be pursuing that. I'm having discussions, as I said, with my colleagues about just how we make sure that's a regular event. Whether it's on every parcel or whether it's on a range of parcels, it's still open to those issues.
Just on that, Minister, there's a question coming over the app about local government's sort of support for the areas that you're redeveloping.
Yeah. So far it's been really, really good. There were some challenges when I was back as the Planning Minister, because we identified various areas that were priority precincts for development. And that ran up, the closer you get to an election, the sillier it gets. So it depended upon what the local council mayor was doing, or whether they're going to stand for state parliament. That's just the risk. That's democracy. But generally, I'd say councils have been very supportive. One of the other areas that I'm really keen to see developed at the moment is an area called Tilapia, which is a very large public housing estate, lots of up to about 8-10 stories, down to about 3-storey units. Fantastic location, right on a railway line, bottom of the hill. There's a public school that's only got 60 children in it. Magic location. Parramatta Council, been all over it, fantastic. And I just love the fact that councils can be so supportive. But if you don't ask, thou shalt not receive. And I'm asking.
Question at the back, thank you.
Morning, Minister. Robert Ferrolo. I was delighted to hear...
Former State Member of Parliament from New South Wales, yes.
Thank you, Brad. Was delighted to hear you talking about the Riverwood project, something I'm quite familiar with. The results there obviously have been very good and a catalyst for what's moving forward. What are your thoughts and strategies for liberating more capital, particularly superannuation funds, to be involved in the provision of more social housing? Well,
superannuation funds as bodies that need to place their funds as part of our competitive proposals with the private sector. I would have thought the private sector would be very keen to involve, and I would have thought superannuation funds, but other funds too. I know I'm very familiar with the fact that, we've had New South Wales booming, but at some point housing starts to slow, and there's some indications that the housing market's starting to slow. What we're proposing in this future directions policy is a $22 billion 10-year pipeline of new investment. I would have thought superannuation funds would be looking at that saying, you beauty, or we're available. But obviously that's for the private sector to work up with them. It's not a matter for government to work up, it's a matter for the private sector and the community housing sector who would be partnering to actually go to them and say, well, what can we do with this? And I know there are a lot of, interestingly, private development firms now that might have been previously more interested in, retail centres and so on, who now have, some of the big ones, have units working madly on how can we bounce off the Communities Plus program from the New South Wales government. So the private sector is attuned to it. The community housing sector is very attuned to it. They're seeing actual outcomes at the moment on the ground, so they know we're fair income about it, and I think there'll be a lot more happening in that space over the next few years.
One final question coming over the app again, Minister. How do you envisage holding the various for-profit, not-for-profit government providers accountable for the sorts of outcomes that you're striving for?
Well, right now, as I was saying, we're in the process of recontracting. And what I've said to the agency is, public servants generally like to think that they are the font of all wisdom, just like ministers, actually. So I've said to the agency, no, we aren't, but we're going to contract with them and we're going to set out what are practical and achievable outcomes within the broad framework of what we've said in future directions. And I've deferred the immediate contract period to allow that discussion to take place. In fact, I attended one of those forums that the public sector, or my agency is having with the the community housing sector about what are reasonable outcomes to be determined. Because I think it's really important at the end of the day, this is a partnership. You know, it may be competitive, but it's also a partnership. And it's a partnership that says, we expect big things of you, but they've got to be achievable things, and we're not going to be so impractical about it that we're going to impose them on you. So let's have a yarn about it, work our way through it, and arrive at what we all think is a reasonable outcome for the people that we all seek to serve. And on that note, thank you, Ian, and thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister.